And then I will welcome Dr. Dawn Matera from the Westport Day School, who has a BS in psychology, an MS in special education, and a doctorate in educational leadership, and numerous years both teaching complex learners and students with learning issues, while also providing tutoring and executive functioning coaching, as well as being the co-founder of the Westport Day School here in Wilton. And I will turn it over to her in just a second once I share the presentation. Okay, Dawn, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me and for coming midday to this. I think it really speaks to the need for some information about executive function, and I really appreciate your participation. So thank you for that. The executive function is a topic I'm extremely passionate about. My work with students with learning disabilities really, propelled me into this area of study. So let's get into it, because it is a short hour for a presentation, and then we're going to save about 30 minutes for questions and answers. And I want everyone to be able to get back to work or their life or whatever they have scheduled next.
Right.
So the guiding principles for today, just so that we sort of are on the same page and that I keep track of my own messaging to you, these are sort of key points and things that will guide us throughout the presentation. So not all adults are skilled in all areas of executive function. And if you're new to the idea and the concept of executive function, we're going to get to that in the next slide. But as for guiding principles, if you have strong executive skills, it does not mean you are strong in all of the 12 areas we're going to talk about today. It's just how the human brain works. So it's not, I think we say so casually, they have an executive function weakness, but it doesn't really tell us that much. And you'll learn about why that is in a few minutes. It is important to remember as you're going through and digesting this information that as the demands in your environment change, the skills that you need to call upon for executive functioning need to still be called up. And then you need to further develop them and apply them to the growing demands in your environment. So what that means is over the lifespan, you have different executive function demands in first grade as fifth grade, and then different demands, heading into preteen, college, and adulthood. So over the lifespan, executive function is always sort of a moving object. You can work on your executive function skills at any point during the lifespan. So this is not something we want to say to kids, well, you need to learn how to do this here and now. This is something we're always working on, and part of the learning process. And our, as we all know, our learning environment and our world and our life, our family, the environments change all the time, and we need to be readjusting. There are long-term executive function impacts and short-term. What I want you to think about is, as we talk about the brain science a little bit and what this means, it's that long-term executive function deficits would come from something that would impact the brain. So you could think about a brain injury or a developmental delay or some kind of cognitive process, right? There's a lot to think about. Those could be long-term deficits because the human brain in certain areas and in certain medical diagnoses and in certain accidents, they will not be able to access certain parts of their brain to be able to apply. And that's when you hear, like, parents will joke around a little bit about teenagers and they'll say, well, I'm their frontal lobe. It's kind of the same thing, right? The executive functions are sort of coming through the brain, through the frontal lobe, and if there is damage there or an underdeveloped frontal lobe, then you are going to need to offer a lot more support. The last thing I want to mention is it's important that we don't use judgment language with our students. It's in children. It's important that we don't say, you're never on time. Your room is always a mess. It's never organized. You can never self-start, right? because that you language really makes students feel frustrated, and it makes us feel bad about ourselves. Like, that's, if someone said to you, you know, you flew in late because something important happened and somebody called you out in the middle of the meeting and said, you're always late. It just doesn't feel good, and it's not productive. So we're going to move from judgment language that you aren't good at this yet to this is an executive function. It's the way our brain works. We need to work on this. Okay, so that's where we're going to head. And the next slide brings us into the history of executive function. So it's important not to think of executive function as a unitary cognitive process. So the research on executive function was coming out early than 1996, but this is where I'm going to start for the purpose of this presentation. So you don't want to look at it as, like I said, the student has an executive function weakness, or the student can't do X, Y, and Z, because it is not a unitary cognitive process. It is an umbrella term that talks about 12 different processes and the brain. So they're all the brain affects all 12 executive functions. All 12 executive functions affect each other and affect the brain. So there's all of these, you know, sort of relationships, and there's so many ways it can go off the rails, right? That we have to be really on top of our executive function. Goldberg in 2001 called it the brain's directive capacities. One statement that kind of really took off in the early 2000s was the CEO of the brain. I like that. You'll hear people talk about that. I think it makes perfect sense. But there's another one that's even better, and I think Brown in 2005 called it the executive function in the brain is the orchestra's conductor. So I love that. If you can visualize the conductor is the brain, the conductor is the executive function, primary way that we access our executive functions, and then the 12 executive functions are like the strings and the, right, so percussion, and then within those you've got, you know, you've got drum, and you have all of these different instruments that need to play at once to play beautifully. If you have someone that is playing in the orchestra who is at a very, very low level, then it's going to impact the orchestra, the performance itself. And you want to think about that for executive function. So for today, our working definition is going to be, and there are many out there. Oh, and I should say, there are not only many definitions out there, there's also, depending on who you ask, I use 12 executive functions because I think that it is just a bit more comprehensive and it kind of gets into the details, but some people say there's 7, and you'll see how they can collapse within each other. But our working definition today is going to be George McCloskey's. He is a leader in this research. You will leave this presentation, and afterwards, sometime this afternoon or this evening, you'll get a resource sheet. And a lot of the books that are, I'm sorry, a lot of the authors that are mentioned here, the researchers, the books, the authors, they're going to be on your resource sheet so you can have them. You're also going to get a copy of the PowerPoint, so you don't have to take a zillion notes. I should have said that first. So working definition. So executive functions are the directive capacities that are responsible for a person's ability to engage in, and this is the important part, purposeful, organized, strategic, self-regulated, goal-directed processing of perceptions, emotions, thoughts, and actions. When you see that definition, it kind of really hits you that there's a lot at play here. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to get into next. I think the next slide is going to be the 12 executive functions. So if you take a look at these here, you can see that I have the 12 set out there. You can imagine those as the orchestra, right? And you can imagine maybe at the top of the screen, the conductor, who is the frontal lobe and who is the brain, managing the interplay, I guess is a good way to put it, between all of these executive functions. So you have self-monitoring and restraint, working memory, emotional control, focus and attention, which I think we all have heard an awful lot about. in terms of executive function and ADHD, task initiation, planning, planning and prioritizing, organization, time management, goal setting, flexibility, metacognition, and stress tolerance. So although it is an aggressive ask to do them all in 1 hour, we're going to do it. So we're going to get through each of them. We're going to talk about what each executive function does and how we see it play out in the home and at school. All right, so that's what we're doing next. Perfect. So self-monitoring and self-regulation is the ability to monitor yourself, your body, your emotions, your behaviors, and really your environment. So what this looks like at home, you want to model, and you're going to hear a lot about modeling and practice and rehearsal. You're going to hear a lot of the same strategies, but the model for self-monitoring at home can be something that you support your student by almost just doing your own thing. Meaning if you are doing a task and you're going through a cookbook and you're going through that cookbook and you're distracted and you're not able to monitor yourself, that is the time for self-talk out loud with your child around that says, wow, I'm really having a hard time regulating this. Why am I so distracted? I think this particular strategy helped me, and this is what caused me to go off sort of the rails. Our students and our children need to know that they are not judged for struggling, because we struggle as well. And we struggle every day. We struggle all the time. So as you look at these 12 executive functions, I want you to think about them from the perspective of you and yourself as a learner. So like when I think about myself as a learner, some of these I'm going to say, hey, I'm really good at that. I know that I've worked on that, or I know that just comes easy to me. And there are going to be other slides that you're like, oh yeah, that one, that's not easy, right? And it depends upon our brain, it depends upon our environment and all kinds of things. But students need to know they're not alone in this. That this is a lifelong learning process, and it is not judged if they are still developing these skills. So you're going to model that. Practice sessions and rehearse. That's always helpful. I find children's books and social stories for younger children to be incredibly helpful. And I would utilize things like timers. Your iPhone has a bunch of really great timers. There's some great online timers that are just super visual, and you can put it right up on a big screen in front of the student if they want that kind of timer. But I think that is a good way. And when we get to time management, we're going to talk a little bit about a strategy for that. At school, I encourage teachers to utilize literature to identify characters who struggle and overcome issues with self-monitoring and self-regulation. And certainly with older students, I think this is, really 4th grade and up, right? So, but once you get into advanced literature with high school and college students, I really do feel that this is helpful. What's even better sometimes for some learners is movies, video clips, and YouTube examples of self-monitoring or any of the executive functions, really, because it's visual. You're seeing it play out. You're seeing the emotion on their face. That's hard to gain sometimes from literature. I also encourage teachers to have regular classroom conversations that withhold judgment regarding these difficulties. We've already sort of covered that. So emotional control. So you can see how, I think some of the models fold emotional control into self-regulation. So you can kind of see how they're certainly connected. And this is simply how well we manage our emotions. And especially with tolerance and frustration and reactions that are appropriate to the situation. So I feel like that's the key, reactions appropriate to the situation. So if your child's emotional reaction to something is disproportionate to the problem itself, they melted down over something very small, that is an emotional control issue. We just have to be careful. We want to make sure that we still teach our kids, our teens, our young adults, how to identify emotion and how to manage it, right? So we could go too far with this like a student who doesn't feel safe or a child who doesn't feel safe identifying or using their emotions are then going to do what? They're going to internalize that, right? They're going to know that it's not preferred in my environment to show too much emotion. And they're going to internalize and they're going to keep that emotion suppressed. We already know that that can be dangerous. So emotional control isn't necessarily not showing emotion or never crying. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? So it's just having the appropriate emotion for the appropriate time. So at home, it's important to get on the child's level, both physically and emotionally. You're going to use emotion words and phrases frequently, such as, you seem frustrated. I am so sorry this is hard for you. Like, I can tell that you're mad. Can I help? So the recipes: identify, validate, and respond. So you definitely want to help the student identify the emotion. And listen, sometimes teenagers struggle with this too. Can they tell between anger and frustration? Can they tell between sadness and anger? Are there multiple things going on? But to identify and validate it and say that this is what humans go through. This is emotional regulation, applies to all of us, not just students. And respond in a compassionate and non-judgmental way. Books, movies, and real-world examples really help this. And I think, some of these strategies you're going to see just as a theme coming through, but I think that's important because some of these strategies are just so beneficial that we should be doing them for all of the executive functions. Zones of regulation at school has been used. I might mention zones of regulation in another slide too. And this is a Michelle Garcia winner construct, if those of you that know about social thinking. And it's for younger students, and it talks about the zones from, like, I think it's blue to red. Like, where are you on the zone? Like, point out where you are and how regulated you are. And I think it's a great concept for younger children. I just think it can also be adapted for older students with more advanced language and more advanced concepts. So we want to normalize that in the classroom. Regular conversations around emotions. And that's not something we see sometimes in high schools, right? So we want to just be able to make sure that in our classrooms, it is a safe space, but it's also a space where we can talk about emotions, because we're all going to have them. And that's sort of just the way things go. I would seek, if you're a classroom teacher, I would seek social work support early on. So as soon as you see a student or students struggling, I would like to see social work, school psychologists, aware and support. Because if you are a classroom teacher with 20 some odd students in the room, even 10, if you're a classroom teacher and you're responsible for not only content and at the same time the emotional control of the students, that's challenging, very challenging from a classroom management perspective. So we want to seek support. We have support in our buildings. We want to seek support early. That's what they're there for. They're there to come in and help your students identify emotions, manage their emotions. And again, books, movies, and real world examples. There is nothing more powerful than watching a movie with your family and hitting pause and saying, wow, this one event, this scary event, this troublesome event, whatever, this happy event, whatever it is, you've got these three characters and they all sort of had a different emotional response to that same event. That is so powerful, because when there's a conflict with students, it is important for them to learn perspective taking, and that every student is going to take what they have to give and use their emotions or display their emotions in that way. It's not going to look the same for everyone. So focus and attention. I feel like focus and attention and organization get the most coverage, news coverage, so to speak, in education. Well, let's talk about it. We think about attentional control when we think about students with learning disabilities, and certainly when we think about students with ADHD. And, this is where I think in the very beginning we had, the basic understanding was quite basic, and it was that if you have a learning disability or if you have ADHD, your executive function skills are impacted. And that's not entirely always true, but there is certainly some overlap there and comorbidity between executive function disorder or executive function, I don't know what we call it a disorder anymore, but executive function difficulties and learning disabilities or in ADHD. So attentional control is an executive functioning skill that involves focusing on certain stimuli in the environment while not focusing on other things. So the ability to focus and attend, but also to tune out, right? And that's the hard part, because our environments, as quiet as we can possibly make them, they're never going to be distraction free, right? We have phones, we have computers. Even if we remove those and a student were working with a pen and a paper, there would still be distractions. The doorbell, the dog barking, hunger, thirst, right? All of these things distract us. And in a classroom, it's tuning out things that could be quite distracting, or just things that that student finds distracting that no one else finds distracting from a sensory standpoint. So at home, to work on this, you're going to create separate distraction-free study spaces. Easier said than done, I know. Use routines, limit screen time. And when you do have your child doing chores and tasks around the house, you want to be short with them, brief, and you want to be age appropriate. So we don't want to give a 7-year-old a really complex chore to do, right? We want to give a 7-year-old one direction at a time, or one chore at a time. You're going to break that task down into manageable parts. You're going to break that task down so that it's success-based. It sounds like a lot, but it's just practice. It's and we're not, as parents, these can't always be done, right? This is not like the perfect parent is going to be able to use all of these strategies all the time. It's just not real life. But to have a really good understanding about executive function and the way the brain works, I think it will seep into your parenting. I don't think you have to go home and like all of a sudden you're gonna parent or teach a different way, right? This is a process of sorts. And some of the books that I have are so great. They're so parent friendly. They're really focused on home, and they're really focused on supporting your student for homework. So you'll see those in the resource sheet too. At school, I like to see teachers give movement breaks for refocus. So it could just be when the things are getting noisy or not enough students are on task. Maybe there's just a brief 30-second, 1-minute movement break. A dance party, it could be anything. And don't think that high school students don't need that too. I'm not saying you're going to break out a dance party and AP Chem, but at the same time, we are humans with brains and bodies that need breaks. And we can't go from class to class and focus without some of this brain break science that we know about. I would keep lessons short if the student or students are struggling with focus and attention. Directions and expectations being extremely clear, up on the board, verbally given, visually given, verbally given, multiple times in multiple places. Maybe the student is using an app to record their homework assignments or their long-term assignments, and you want to be involved in that. You want to be involved in saying, I'll help you break that down. Let's put these dates in your app, right? There are ways we can help. And some students are using written planners, right? Whatever they're using, you want to be involved in that and guiding them through that. If you can keep your classroom neat and organized, that really does help with focus and attention, and your environment should not be overstimulating. The hard part about that is what is overstimulating to one student is perfectly lovely for another student. So it's this blanket suggestion not to have things be too messy. So just kind of keep in mind that when things are disorganized, feeling out of sorts, or there's too much to look at, more of your class could have the tendency to be overstimulated, and then it would impact their focus. Task initiation is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I think that it's a big deal, and this is one that I personally struggle with. And I sort of pride myself in having decent executive function skills, but this one's a problem. This one's tough. Ability to start a task without procrastination. And I'll have kids say to me, teenagers say to me, well, I'm a procrastinator. I can't ever start it. I'm just a procrastinator. And my answer to them is, you're not a procrastinator. Your brain is working in a way that it's tough for you to initiate a task. And we have to work on that. Again, taking away the judgment. So at home, anytime you expect your child to start a task, whether it be getting in the car, whether it be starting a homework assignment, cleaning the playroom, whatever it is, you want to model and give like really clear directions and an example of what you're looking for. I think fidget toys in the environment are great. And that one works for, you know, all of the executive functions. You're going to utilize timers and checklists. So maybe they just don't know where to start, right? I make myself checklists when I get overwhelmed. So the minute I get overwhelmed, the minute I know that I'm going to procrastinate and I'm feeling like I need to procrastinate, I start my checklist. That works for me. And then I can kind of just like cross off one thing and then suddenly I'm in it, right? Sometimes it just takes that first 15 minutes of success and then you're rolling along and you can start that. So you're going to set the child up for success. You're going to reduce clutter and study space in the home, and especially in spaces where a certain task is required. We don't want to overwhelm them. We don't. And their brains are developing. So we need to really participate in their development of their frontal lobe by breaking things down and helping them initiate a task. At school, you will see teachers having predictable classroom routines and guidelines. Our best teachers are, you know, super organized and students know what to expect. And that is extremely helpful when helping students initiate tasks. So the teacher would set something up, they would model it, they would give examples, they would maybe use a rubric or a checklist. Schools and teachers are really good at this. And in fact, I would, if you are a parent on this webinar, I would even encourage you to say to the teacher, how are they in school initiating tasks and getting things started or procrastinating? If they're not seeing it in school, but you're seeing it at home, I mean, sure, they've had a long day, right? And they're coming home. So there's that. But maybe there's some strategies that you can use that the classroom teacher uses that would bridge the gap and, you know, help your student feel as if they are going to be successful at home. Teachers with students that have task initiation problems, especially special education students, are going to need one task at a time, then two, then three, and you're going to build up and scaffold support while you go. So planning and prioritizing. I feel like this one gets lumped together with organization sometimes in other models. So it's super important, and it's the ability to accurately estimate the time required, how much time one has, and allocate time effectively to meet deadlines. And it also includes an awareness that time matters. And we all know humans that don't seem to have any concept of time, right? And the concept of time and these abilities to meet deadlines and judge your process and know that this task is going to take me, is it going to take me 3 hours to clean my, is it going to take me 3 hours to clean my apartment, or is it going to take me 30 minutes to clean my apartment? And that could change the whole day. And think about all the tasks the students have to plan and prioritize, high school students especially. They're not given much support, right, as far as the day-to-day planning and prioritizing. They've learned those skills for the most part, unless they're in resource. And now they have to manage 5, 6, 7 classes a day and all of the work that goes along with it. So it's a lot. At home, to promote planning and prioritizing in real life, I would utilize family calendars. There is a reminders app that we use at school, and you can use it for families, you can use it for teachers can use it for students. And I think there's a variety of apps out there for things like calendars that are shared and reminders. Children and teens require more time, more organization, and more support than adults in this area, for the most part, unless, you know, we know some adults that really struggle with this, but for the most part, it is a very high level executive function. It's, you know, really comes later in the development. So the more of the lifespan of a student. So you really want to support this in early education while your student is in elementary school or middle school, it's really helpful to know that they're going to need this and it takes time to develop. If adults in the home struggle with this executive function, and hey, no judgment, right? We all have these pieces of this that you could probably look at and identify and say, yeah, that's awful, right? I'm not good at that. So it's very common for adults, especially in a busy home, single parent, two parents, multiple children, multiple sports, multiple activities. It's a lot. And then not to mention the world at large is chaos. So this is something that if the adult struggles, I would really be intentional about the strategies I'm putting into place in my home. I would identify it and say, like, we're struggling as a family with calendaring or making appointments, planning ahead, procrastinating, things we have to prioritize and plan for. So if we can be intentional with it, that's perfect, but it's also maybe a place where we need a professional organizer or someone who's an executive function coach to come into the home a couple of times. This is not something you need necessarily to have long term, but if you have a few sessions with someone who really does this work, I mean, why not get you started off on the right foot? Learn things. I mean, we call someone to work on our car. We call someone to work on our plumbing. You know, we call someone to do things like yard cleanup. Like, why not have someone come in for a few hours and help us with this? I think the schools knock this one out of the park. I think schools and teachers have such a strong, I feel like being a teacher for so many years, I was really good at this at school and then maybe not so great at it at home. So I don't know if that applies to anybody else out there, but that's sort of the way it works for me. At school, you'll see teachers giving rubrics, a syllabus giving all the assignments, or even just a written assignment sheet per assignment with directions. Frequent reminders, teachers are writing assignments on the board, prioritizing what the student, like, do they need to remember and prioritize the vocabulary quiz that's coming up next? Those are the kind of things that we need to look at. And I would hold planning and prioritizing meetings in small groups or one-to-one. And the reason I say that is because students are at different levels of planning and prioritizing. So by, you know, giving one blanket planning statement or planning strategy to the class, you're going to lose some kids. You're going to lose some kids because they already can do it and they already are feeling held back by the fact that you're talking about it. And then there's going to be students that just don't get it yet and need a lot more of your support. So I always suggest, you know, little tiny check-ins, small group meetings on the fly when you're seeing this happen. I think organization and planning and prioritizing are often presented together. I like to look at this differently because it talks about the organization of your personal materials and schedules and in your physical environment, but also your thoughts. Big part of organization that we don't talk enough about. Because if your thoughts are disordered, your thoughts are distracted, if you are confused, if you have trouble with perceptions of reality, if you misperceive, if you have a student or a child who misperceives, then this is going to bleed into organization. So at home, you want to break tasks into the smallest parts possible, checklists and to-do lists. You want to have very predictable routines if you can. And you're going to model successful and unsuccessful attempts at organization. My favorite way to teach executive function in general and all of these skills in isolation is to share your in the moment, in the day, or stories from the past, your unsuccessful attempts at something. When you've gotten frustrated, when you didn't plan ahead enough, when you struggled with your environment. I think we need more of that kind of discourse with our families and kids and our teachers and students across the board, because unsuccessful attempts at organization or at anything is an opportunity for learning, right? We're doing it all the time. We're doing it across the lifespan. Why are we expecting our kids to get it right away, right? This is a process. So if by you modeling that you are still working on this as an adult, and as you're going into your adult life, maybe you're switching jobs. Now all of a sudden your organization and planning needs to change because you're reacting to a new environment. So that goes back to that first slide, or one of the first slides, where we said, you know, you're going to need to call up what you previously know about said topic, about organization, and then you're going to have to apply it to a new environment and then possibly develop new skills. And Eve and I were talking at the beginning of this about like new skills being like the webinars and all the tech stuff that goes along with everything right now. You know, in my age group, most of us are needing to adapt to a changing environment in this fast-paced tech world, and we're calling upon what we used to do, and we're trying, but it is fast moving for us, and our kids need to know that that's how organization works. Right, so instead of judgment, which is you're organized or you're unorganized, it's way more complicated than that, and I don't like to impose that on our kids. I think the schools you'll see using lots of rubrics, checklists, clear expectations for assignments. I think if as a teacher, you could involve your students in these organizational strategies, get their ideas, get their input. I think that's amazing. And teachers do a great job of using things like Venn diagrams, mind mapping, KWL charts, and other visual organizational tools prior to, say, a writing task, or some other study task. And if you think about all of those graphic organizers and mind maps and brainstorming, that all is activating prior knowledge. It's also helping you regulate because you're focused on the task, and now you're able to organize your thoughts. So that is so very important. And I'm not saying you're going to whip out a Venn diagram in the kitchen at home, but just know that sometimes there's a brainstorming session before something complex gets introduced in school, and that could put something potentially could work there. One of the things I like to see students do is before, like, instead of doing a diagram or a mind map or some other academic tool at home, you know, you can even say, okay, you know, you're going to clean your room. I'm going to help you. We're going to do it in little steps. Why don't you draw me a picture of what you would like your room to look like after, right? And this is great for some kids who love to draw. So you can map out, you can draw out, you can doodle, and it just helps students get regulated and organize their thoughts. Time management is a tough one, because in time management, it is also the ability to estimate the time required and how much time you have. Can they allocate the time effectively to meet deadlines? And it also includes an awareness that time matters. Did we do time management before? No. Okay. So practice estimating time for tasks, testing the theory with a timer. I'm going to give you guys a worksheet that you could use at home. It's actually from this book by, I don't know if you can see me in the corner there, by Peg Dawson, and it is called Smart But Scattered Teens. Love the book. It'll be on your resource sheet, and I'm going to give you, so you don't have to go buy the book, I'll give you a sample from it. And what it is it's, you know, essentially, what task do you have to do? How long do you think it's going to take? I think it's going to take 30 minutes. Okay, let's do it. We'll do the task, do your work, and then let's see how long it was. Students can say, it's going to take me 30 minutes. It could take them 5. They're like, I'm done. Or an hour later, they're still working on the same task. That is problematic, right? We want to make sure that as our students progress from elementary to middle to high school and beyond, that they are developing time management skills that they are going to desperately need as an adult. You want to demonstrate that sometimes increased work speed is necessary, right? If you've got a deadline and you need to meet it fast, it can't be your best work, but it needs to be finished. That's okay sometimes. We need to tell them that. It may affect your quality, it may affect your outcomes, but there may also be plenty of times when you can slow it down to improve the quality of your work. So for kids that rush through things, I think they need to understand that, yes, there are times that that's a great strategy and that will serve you well in your life as an adult, but you also need to slow it down when needed for quality purposes. If you can, try to arrive on time for activities and play dates and other things like that. Sports, that's helpful. It's teaching your children that time matters. The coach's time needs to be respected, and we need to make sure we're there. Family modeling of this, and again, calendars and reminders. I think teachers could utilize timers, clocks, and apps per student in small groups or with the whole classroom. If you create predictable schedules within the classroom, meaning that maybe the schedule is on the board with the times, right? So that they can kind of look ahead and know that this class is 40 minutes long. We leave at 10:35. Like, keep reinforcing that throughout the day. And there are students who struggle with this that are going to need more support from you than others. And it's not always the special ed students. It's not always the special ed students. There are many, many neurotypical learners who at all cognitive levels who struggle with time management. So, some of these, I don't like to think of executive function as a special education problem, because it's not. Special education, I think, through the lens of special education, we can talk about all these constructs, like with the vocabulary and the sort of pragmatics that we work with, but it's not just for special ed, not for special ed. So goal setting and achieving your goals. I think at home, if you utilize both personal goal setting and family goal setting, and it could be small, it could be like, we're going to set this goal as a family and we're going to treat ourselves to, our favorite dinner or a family movie or a family game night or whatever it is. Those little things that you can do to set goals as a family or set goals with just one of your children. Chores should be broken down into manageable parts. You're going to create success-based climate. I feel like you can see that a lot of these strategies for these things are incredibly similar and they're overlapping, because goal setting and achieving those goals in organization impacts the goal, right? Everything folds and maps onto each other. So the strategies do the same. You're going to share personal examples of successful and unsuccessful goals you have set in the past. I mean, how about those goals that as adults we've never reached and we've decided it wasn't a great goal to begin with, right? I mean, we don't have to set these rigid goals and always make them. We're going to talk about flexible thinking soon. At school, you're going to utilize both individualized goal setting and group goal setting. You're going to hopefully break down the goals into managing parts. I love teacher and peer conferencing for this. I think the teacher could be one-to-one with students or small groups, and peer conferencing when appropriate. Your classroom best if it's appropriate and you think your class can do it successfully. I think it's powerful. Daily check-ins. And when students struggle, create more structure and support, structure and support. It's so very challenging being a classroom teacher and having, 25 students, say 6 periods a day-ish. And yet you're still trying to create more structure and support for some students. So I think that this is one of those things where daily check-ins and mini conferencing is worth the time spent if you put it into your day. Flexibility. So being mentally flexible is the ability to shift our thoughts, emotions, plans, and actions based on new data. So we all know that flexibility is hard, and some of our students are more rigid in their thought and inflexible in their environment, almost like a 3 or a 5-year-old who's used to be going to bed a certain way. You don't want to change up bedtime, right? It's the same kind of thing. Changes in the environment or new data that's coming in, how you react to that from a stress response, which we'll talk about in a minute, matters. So that the more cognitively and emotionally flexible you can be, the better your outcomes. So there is a book called, or maybe it's a checklist. I'm sorry, it's not a book, it's a checklist. How flexible is your teen? I'm going to give you this one too. And this one's for parents, just to identify the areas of strength and weaknesses with your student. But I also think what it's so great about the checklist, less important what the results come out as, but I think it's more important for the parent to be able to be like, wow, this flexibility issue isn't just my student, my kid on the spectrum. It's not just my student with ADHD. People, humans have trouble with cognitive flexibility, flexible planning, and it is a challenge. So just to see what items are on the checklist and how you think about them is actually even just very helpful. I always encourage my families and my teachers to use phrases like, thank you for being flexible. And the reason being is because flexibility is a hard construct to comprehend. It isn't, physical flexibility, like you could touch your toes, like all that makes a lot of sense, but cognitive flexibility is hard to teach. And it's hard to describe. So when I have a student, well, let me use my grandkids as an example. If, there's a toy and he wanted that toy, his brother wanted a toy or whatever it was, if that one of them gave in and said, oh, you know what, he can have that one, I'll have this one, I also like the red one, I will say, thank you for being flexible, because they need to learn really early on that that action was flexibility and that action is desired. Because otherwise they go through their life being flexible at times and they only hear about their inflexibility. And I feel like even the most rigid, cognitively rigid students display really wonderful moments of flexibility. And I like to find those moments, and I encourage you to find those moments. Families can practice mindfulness to calm the nervous system. I recommend, I'm going to give you a few apps that I recommend. One is called Guided Mind. The other is called Calm. And they're brief little, it could be a 1-minute activity to a 30-minute activity, but they calm the nervous system so that they can approach their emotions and their flexibility. In the classroom, we use games and group activities that support this kind of flexibility. Michelle Garcia Winner, who I mentioned earlier, has a superhero named Superflex. And, executive functions and flexibility, it really is a superpower, right? It is something that we all work on, and we all know our blind spots when it comes to flexibility. Some areas of your life, you might be incredibly flexible. Other areas of your life, not so much. So I caution you when, we're looking at our kids, like we're the same way, where our brains are working the same way. But if you do have younger students, I would, at home, if you have younger students in your classroom or at home, I would look at Michelle Garcia Winner's Superflex, and I'm blanking on the name of the book series, but I know somebody out there already knows it. But the social thinking program with Michelle Garcia Winner is wonderful for this for younger students. I would also, in my classrooms, practice some breathing exercises, short guided meditations, anything that can allow them to calm the nervous system before they are asked to do a task and be flexible all at the same time. Metacognition is another thing that I present on. It's another topic I present on, and I love the topic, and it's essentially thinking about your thinking. And the more self-reflective we are, the better the outcomes. So what does this mean for students who are just developing this or just starting to develop metacognition? Modeling your own thinking process is so important. And what that looks like is, oh, I'm stuck. Let me use the index to find this topic. Or, gee, I don't know why my car isn't starting. Let me think about what I should do next. We have to be somewhere in 10 minutes. Like, just modeling the thought process helps. Also, you want to use positive self-talk and encourage a positive self-talk in your children. Right? It's very impactful when we talk down about ourselves, right? So if we say there's something about ourselves that we don't like, that is something our kids pick up on. So positive self-talk, hard and challenging, sure, but I think it goes a long way in sort of a healthy metacognitive process. You're also going to ask questions such as, how did you come to that answer? Or how did you come to that decision? I feel like when we see a student do something that's undesirable, or a child, we often just assume why we just think we know exactly what it was. It was right there, played out right in front of us. We already knew what they were thinking. But that's not always the case. We don't know what they're thinking. So by having them access the metacognitive skill, you're saying, well, how did you come to that decision? Sure, we're going to make a better decision next time. No big deal. But like, what were you feeling at the time? What were you thinking? What were you thinking? You know, how, and not in a, that's the next bullet, not in a, what were you thinking derogatory way or a sarcastic way, in a way, but like, I'm interested in how you think. I'm interested in what your feelings are. And we're often wrong. It's usually something completely different than we thought it was. And then you can address it. In school, I love metacognitive strategies in schools because I think teachers are doing a great job in this area, summoning and supporting the retrieval of prior knowledge. We have activities for that. We have think alouds, we have read alouds, and we hopefully are using learning style language with students. Because again, what one student can do is different than what another student can do, and that's fine. And they may approach that learning activity from very different perspectives, and that's also fine. So using Gardner's multiple intelligence language, using the lens of their personal learning style, that's how we can get kids to sort of apply and understand that they don't have to be perfect, and then that maybe they learn a little bit differently than the person next to them. And again, we're not talking about special ed kids, we're talking about all kids. So stress tolerance, I mean, this is a tough one because our world is on fire, and as I would love to do like a stress tolerance for adults, right? I mean, we are at a we're in a fast-paced environment. We fit many, almost too many things into one day. Change comes at us, and it's very hard to manage uncertainty. So at home, I would limit or adjust news coverage in your home to consider age and maturity. This is, you know, what you would do for an 8-year-old will be very different than what you do for an 18-year-old. So you're going to have to make adjustments there. You're going to limit adult conversations about adult topics like family finances or, you know, crazy Aunt Mary or whatever it is. Like, you definitely want to limit what your kids can hear. And it's amazing when you think they're not listening, they are. It's like amazing how good their comprehension is when you don't want it to be. So I would just take like any heavy, weighty topics that we would stress our children and try to have those outside of, you know, the environment or when they are not there. You're going to teach stress reducing acts of self-care in the home. Even toddlers can learn to use self-care to manage stress. What does that look like? So that looks different for everyone, right? Like, you know, maybe for one family member, it's a bubble bath and being left alone for 30 minutes to read a book in the bath. And maybe for another student, maybe for one of your kids, it's going for a bike ride. So we have to really make sure that as we're individualizing for executive function support, we're also understanding what I need is maybe not what you need for self-care. At school, teachers can set up spaces within the classroom for breaks due to stress. I know lots of classrooms have this. I've even seen some high school classrooms with this, and kudos to the high school teachers that are really reading the room. They know that high school stress, high school heading into college, the news coverage, you're not able to manage your news coverage much. I mean, it's at that point, it's talking about the news, right? So spaces within, I think, even a high school classroom are important for stress reducing. Teachers can begin to see behaviors as stress instead of bad behavior and offer support. Classroom books that identify stressful situations and how to choose a break, and lots of fidget, drawing, listening to music when appropriate. I know it's not always appropriate, and I know that some students are distracted by fidgets, but the students who aren't distracted by fidgets need them to ground themselves, and they need them to really get through that stressful situation and to cope. So don't dismiss it as distracting until, you know, we know for sure which students need it and which students it's helpful for and not. Okay, so I have questions I can take, comments. They could be school related. You could put your question in the chat if you have one, or you're welcome to you know, turn your camera on and chat.
Yeah, and for those questions that are in the chat, I'm happy to moderate them and read them to Dawn as needed. And also, like Dawn alluded to earlier, you will receive the PowerPoint and her resources after. For those of you that are Wilton residents, I would strongly encourage you to sign up for email alerts through the town website, because that is where some of it will be posted. It will also be cross-posted on the Wilton SPED website, as well as some other local resources and places.
The other thing I can say is that we are planning an in-person 4-hour workshop for parents. And there's going to be a separate one for teachers as well. We're planning that. So if you would be interested, and we're going to try to keep the cost really low, so it shouldn't be too expensive to attend. It'll be a 4-hour like mini conference in Wilton at the Westport Day School. We'll do one for parents on this topic and one for teachers, and there'll be scholarships available for, no one will, you know, not be able to attend because of the cost. So there will be scholarships available as well. I will have Whitney, who you will be receiving all this information from. I'll have her include that on the resource sheet or the PowerPoint somewhere, so that if you are interested, you can kind of get on our mailing list, or you can, you know, sign up through Whitney once we have the date set. So if you are interested in an in-person 4-hour, I think it'll be a 10 to 2 on a weekend. If you're interested and you wanted to learn more, make sure Whitney has your name and how to contact you. And if there aren't, oh, there's it.
We got our first question. So this question is, could you speak a little bit about perfectionism and how to respond to the emotional dysregulation that comes when my child can't be perfect?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I've seen it a lot in written work. I don't know. Can you specifically tell me in what setting or in all settings? Is it, I don't know, is it academic? Is it, I could speak to both, mainly written work. Yep. Absolutely. So yeah, it's a lot of times it's written work. I think one thing that can help is, you could tell me how old your student is, that would be helpful too. But one thing that I do think helps is that if you set up things that are writing, like a journal, right? Like you're just going to draw a picture and write about your trip to the zoo, or we're going to write down this grocery list. 9 years old, ADHD. Okay. We're going to write this grocery list together then, right? And where, you know, you can model not being perfect. Like your grocery list and that piece of paper you write it on, if you still write it on a piece of paper like I do, it's going to be messy, right? It's never going to look perfect. A journal is meant to draw and get your feelings out, and maybe your student likes photography or animals or something that you can engage them with a journal in. And then this way, oh no, we're not looking, like that doesn't have to be perfect, right? Sort of practicing the imperfect parts of writing so that when they do approach their assignment, you know, you could say, oh, you know, the N in your name dipped below the line, right? And they're erasing it and they're starting it. That's the perfectionism that we see. It's something that is really knotted up in, it could be knotted up in like obsessive compulsive types of, so I think one thing I can suggest is getting to the root of that perfectionism through some sort of testing. Right? So like, is there something else? Is that perfectionism coming from a great deal of anxiety? Is that perfectionism coming from sort of like an OCD process, right? So I think trying to get to the root of it, number one, and then in the real world, stressing imperfections are very normal and very beautiful. And like, this is the way that I write when I need to send a card, and this is the way that I write when I need to do my homework. And like, what you do on your nightly homework may not need to be as perfect as what you do on a test, which may not need to be as perfect as what you do on your college application. So kind of just, it's kind of a slow fix. But it is a struggle, and especially at 9, that's hard.
And while we wait for more questions, just to put this out there, although it's in the chat, for anyone, Dawn, yourself included, or any other professionals that are here today, if you are in Wilton, you are able to apply for gifting grants through the town PTAs to assist in supporting the financial piece of any professional development around this topic.
Wonderful. And Kara just said that's only for Wilton staff. So
It's that way. Thank you, Kara.
okay, great. If there's not any further questions, you'll have my email and my contact information and the parent resources that will be coming to you sometime today. And I thank you for being here. This has been fabulous. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for facilitating the discussion and providing all the knowledge. And again, for those of you, you will receive any follow-up materials in a variety of ways.
Thanks. You guys are great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dawn.